the screen. That's why I wanted you to have a few of your own, so you can look at those elements together. Now, do we know if this is working or we haven't figured it out?
It is not working. You are not getting anything through.
Tom, can you hear?
We usually have a split of one sort or another.
Hey, Tom? Tom Elliott?
I can speak.
Yep.
No,
Okay, listen.
No, you're
can see
good.
if you can hear Michael. Would you say something, Mike? He's online.
Okay. Can you hear me through the speakers or just hear me?
Yeah, we just.
Well, first off, can you hear him online? No, I don't think so.
Yeah,
Okay,
Well, we hear Tom.
yeah.
loud and clear.
Can you
Yeah.
hear-
okay.
You'd think after all this time,
Yeah, I know.
we'd have nailed it.
Yeah.
Green light's on, right?
Yep.
All right, and put it up to your mouth.
Is that better? I can use it as a nose ring. I'll have to hold it way up here.
If anyone can't hear, let us know.
All right. Well, I don't want to blow anyone out of the audience just yet. This
I
part
can
of,
hear Michael fine.
okay, I'll try to keep the mic where it belongs, and then you're ready to record?
Yes, I just turned it
Okay, very good. So the intent of the next 4 lectures is to take us through the last year of the war. But I wanted to start off with something that I think is of particular importance to understand, not just for World War II, but for almost every conflict. Now, this author, Clausewitz, who wrote during the Napoleonic era, was probably one of the most internationally known and studied military philosophers for literally the last 200 plus years. And while his comments have been disparaged and modified in a lot of different ways, I thought we would start out with this because it's of particular importance to us in understanding what actually is happening. Not just in World War II, but what is happening literally today. So take a moment and read it. Normally, I do not like to read my slides to anyone, so I figure you're all able to do that yourselves. But I want to point out that the opening phrase has often been shortened to say that war is politics by different method or means. But what is particularly important is actually the second part. An act of violence intended to compel our opponent to fulfill our will. That emphasis cannot be made clear enough for us to understand that any particular national act of violence, war, terrorism, if you want to use that, whatever it is, internal or external to a nation, involves this very issue. It follows that he who uses force unsparingly. Don't bring a knife to a gunfight. If you're going to win, the importance is to win quickly and as efficiently as possible in order to compel your opponent to submit to your will. Up until World War II, it was a rarity for a nation to be utterly, completely, categorically wrecked to the point where the opponent had total dominance. Now, one example might be with the fall of Constantinople in 1453, when Mehmed II took that city and basically destroyed in its entirety the remnants of the Roman Empire located in the east at Byzantium/Constantinople, now Istanbul. But if you think about all the wars that occurred subsequently in Europe, especially from that point on, no country was totally, utterly crushed by its opponents. So here we are, 500 years after that event, in the mid-1900s, where we're facing a situation in which both sides will use unrestrained violence in order to compel an outcome consistent with their desires. How did this happen?
How do you print it?
We've talked about it in a number of situations, but I want to review something very, I hope, simple and straightforward. If I can find where devices have disappeared to, that's the other thing that we've done right here. Yep. Yeah. Well, magic. Oh, here we go. Okay,
You don't feel to actually,
try it.
yeah.
Okay. I'm not into nose rings, so it won't work for me. So we ask ourselves the following questions. First, why doesn't this work? There we go. Okay, is it still hearable? And to the Zoom folks?
You don't let me-
Okay. At this particular time, just prior to the invasion of Normandy, Germany in particular, we're going to put the Pacific Theater on hold for now, is really up against it. They've been hammered badly in the East. They've been in forced retreat since the middle of 1943. Is it not happening? Okay. And they know that the Allies are going to invade the continent. They don't know where, they're not exactly sure when, but they know it is coming. And once the Allies have achieved a foothold in the continent, Italy being a sideshow, in spite of that technically being part of the continent, they know that they'll be up against a two-front war. The one thing that wrecked them in their own historical perspective in World War I, that fighting a two-front war was beyond their means. So what do you do at this point? If you are the German government, is this the time to negotiate a surrender? Is this the time to say, we're willing to have a ceasefire, get everybody to stop killing each other? Remember, German cities are being bombed heavily, so it's not something that's only happening on the battlefront. And if we can achieve a surrender, we will withdraw to our 1939 borders. You're the Allies. Is that acceptable? You're in that position of having to make a decision. Now, if you think about it, how is that different from what's going on in Ukraine? You want to compel Putin to withdraw back to his February, 2022 borders? How are you going to make him do that? In addition, you end up realizing, we talked about this before, that Roosevelt at Casablanca had indicated to the German people unconditional surrender. Ooh, well, if I'm the German government, what is my negotiating position at that point? Go to Roosevelt and say you have to back off on that? You know, let's find a better path, because everyone tends to look at the concept of diplomacy as a way to end conflicts. Every conflict ends ultimately in a political solution. Obliteration of your enemy is hardly one solution historically that seems to work. So nearly every conflict ends with some political compromise. But if you're faced with unconditional surrender, what does that mean to you? How do you react to that? Yes, okay, done. In addition, as that first paragraph indicated, unrestrained violence. If what you're facing appears to be a complete destruction of your society, your industry, your moral basis, however perverse that may be to others, how much of that can you give up? Want an example? American Civil War. The South looks at this and says, if we give up everything we've had since our inception, not as the Confederacy, but as Southern slave-owning states, and the whole moral and economic and social environment disappears. You want another example? Think of the Taliban taking over. You now are living under Sharia law. You must behave according to the principles we've laid out. No alcohol, no music. Women cannot go out without a chaperone and must be completely covered. And so on and so on and so on. So there are points at which, to use an old phrase, I'd rather die standing than be a slave on my knees. Now, I am not saying that what the German government did and Hitler and his cronies was in any way acceptable. What I'm trying to do is emphasize, not just for this discussion, but for what we are facing right now in this world, is a blend of ideologies that have incompatible endings. Is there a way to stop this conflict short of the complete destruction of Germany? Not very likely. So what happens at this point? The Allies are recognizing that Europe looks like this. Now, don't worry about the colors, but the idea behind it is that the grayish areas you see are held by Germany in one form or another. You can see that the Soviets have moved from the environs of Moscow into Poland, and we talked about that in the last set of lectures. But Germany still is largely intact and formidable, despite 5 years of fighting. So something has got to give. And the Allies, particularly the British and the Americans, who do not have anything more than a small, and I'm using it as a pun, foothold on the continent of Europe, have to do something bigger and greater. What does that involve? Now, as I said, these maps are going to be somewhat confusing. I don't want you to try to focus except on something very big. German defenses and the Allied concentration of units, and they've got to find a way to get into the continent of Europe. What choices exist? They were all discussed. This was not a situation where this was the so-called obvious route. What about, since you're already in Italy, if you build up your forces take Corsica and Sardinia and use them as bases as well to attack southern France. Wouldn't that tend to work for you? Well, the problem is that if you attack here, all these German troops are able, if they're even defeated, to get back here, but they can rush their reinforcements down there. The shipping that is required to land is coming from England. If you base it in North Africa, you've told everybody where you're going. And the Balkans is a non-entity in terms of an attack route, despite Churchill's desire. What about going across to Norway? Gee, if we take Norway, we can put air bases up there. There's some good ports. Still gives us flexibility of where to attack. The problem is there are no sizable airfields up there. You have to build them, construct them. It's terrible terrain. The ports would have to be rebuilt, all of which would telegraph where you're headed, and it would probably delay the invasion for a year. Yes, Robert.
Furthermore, you land in Norway, you have to come south.
Right.
And all the fjords run east to west. And that is horrendous territory to try to get over.
Right. And submarines and the rest of it can hide in those areas and come out and really damage your transports badly. Going into the very north reaches was considered trying to land on the northern edge of Germany itself, catching all of these guys out of balance and giving you the opportunity to penetrate and establish yourself there. There's a problem. Sea routes, very congested. The air defenses the Germans could muster to protect Germany itself would be of great value to resisting the invasion. And you've got transport routes that can allow a fast ship transfer of reinforcements to the area. Resupply would be difficult. So this was considered, and it was decided it was not usable. What about right here? Right across from England to Calais. It's a short trip, 20 miles. Shouldn't be difficult at all. And if you have some big railway guns here, they can actually reach some of the beach areas. So they can provide a land-based heavy artillery support in addition to sealing off this area pretty easily to prevent any German submarines from coming in. And if you land there and are successful, you're very close to the borders with Germany, and all of these guys have to scamper a long distance out. That was considered the most favorable place. Hitler knew that. So he concentrated major forces in that area for the express purpose of being able to resist that invasion very, very quickly. Now, there had been an argument going on, particularly between Rommel and Rundstedt, over the best way to conduct the defense of the continent. Rommel wanted to stop the invasion at the beaches, figuring that's when the oncoming forces were at their most vulnerable. And you had to have your reserves near enough to be able to get to the beaches quickly and overpower the defenders. Now, the problem is Rundstedt saw it was this. First, the naval support and air support will destroy the reserves if they're too close to the front. Also, you're not entirely sure where you have to concentrate your power. So you're better off being a little bit safer to the rear, figuring out the biggest points that you have to defend in that invasion, and that's when you go at them at that point. They'll still be struggling, but this is the way to get at them. So how does the Allied forces decide on Normandy. And what did they do to prepare the battlefield? Now, I want you to think of the following concept. The buildup has about 3 million soldiers in England, thousands of airplanes, and thousands of ships and landing craft of various sorts. The complexity is staggering. The planning has to include not just getting your initial invasion force onto the continent. You have to sustain them, and you have to keep feeding in reinforcements and supplies, not just over a couple days, but over several months. So the complexity, every ship has to know what its job is. Every airplane, everyone that's flying has to know what his job is. And on top of it, you know you're going to take losses. So in terms of that, the planning here, which began much earlier, took months and months and months of work. Take one ship, figure out how much can it carry? What can it carry? Can it carry just munitions, food? Does it carry troops? Does it carry heavy equipment, artillery, tanks? If it's artillery, how do I get it on the beach? How do I get the tanks there? And so on and so on and so on. So this undertaking was huge. So why Normandy? Within air cover, first and foremost. Secondly, in planning the routes, and you're going to see it on another slide, where all the ships are going to congregate and land, you need a broad enough area. You can't stack them up, one after the other. In fact, one of Field Marshal Montgomery's greatest contributions to this landing was the initial proposal was actually quite a bit shorter. And he said that's too small an area. We need a much larger area with a larger landing force. 5 divisions instead of 3, 50 miles instead of 30. Now, 50 miles, think about that. If you drive from here to Ithaca, it's about 50 miles. Each mile you travel, if you're not driving, look out the window and look at the terrain and ask yourself, how would I attack this or how would I defend it? And pretend that the area behind you is flat, all right? Because the sea tends not to give you much in the way of terrain. This thing keeps dying. So all of this issue had to be thought out. And to make it even more complex, each day there was what was called a phase line. You were supposed to reach that line by day X. And by, usually they were broadened out now to 1 day, but to a week or even a month, that they were supposed to be along the line of the Somme by about 3 months, D plus 90. Think of the planning now. You have to keep feeding things in 3 months, but the war isn't over there, right? If you're only here by September, you've got to go all that way to the end. So the logistical complexity here is absolutely staggering. This gives you a little bit close-up of what I was discussing. There's a diversion that was to make the German high command think Calais was the target. And in addition, Patton's Third Army, which isn't shown here, was acting as a decoy as well, that they had radio traffic and dummy construction of tanks and airplanes and all kinds of stuff concentrated in this area so that the Germans would think that was going to be the target, the most logical, easiest place to hit. And if some of you recall the movie The Longest Day, which has some very good parts to it and some absolutely horrible parts to it, one of the key things is that the Germans, with the deterioration of weather, said there's just no way you can bring an invasion force across the channel and land under those conditions. Now, to flip it again, let's look at it from this perspective. We knew from the Pacific landings, but we also knew from landings in North Africa and Italy that we had to know tides, we had to know moonlight, because in this situation, we were going to drop a bunch of parachutists all over the place, down through here and out at this edge over here. So every condition had to be just right. Again, think of the complexity of how many people are involved in each of these, and each person has to be trained to do it. And it also has to be done in such a degree of secrecy that you don't let the Germans know where you're coming or precisely when. So again, just from that standpoint, this is an amazing undertaking. This broad slide, and I'm going to go into detail more, shows you the sea transports coming from way up here, way over here. Notice they're crossing the state of Dover, that narrow segment. You'd think, well, can't the Germans spot them coming? No, whatever. How did they not see this? They have to be concentrated in one area so they can approach the beaches on a very carefully set timetable. That means every ship that is traveling has a certain speed, that the aircraft that are flying in to drop the paratroopers, coming in here, all has to be timed precisely. And if you think about the difficulties we've had at Reagan Airport just recently with modern air control, think of what it's like when you're concentrating 2,000 or 3,000 aircraft in an area that isn't a whole lot bigger. When you really think about it, the air congestion itself is extraordinary. Okay. This is just a close-up, and it gets you an idea of what's what. These symbols down here, this is the 21st Panzer Division, that's the 12th SS, that's the 1st SS, this is a 116th Panzer, this is an Army Corps under General Rommel. He's got that area under his control. But it shows you how complex this whole thing is. Now, when the landings actually occur, and this slide shows you the gains in the first week. I'm going to come back and get into a little more detail in a moment. This calm was to be an objective on day one. They didn't get there for weeks. The beaches were to be unified on day one. That didn't happen either. So as they say, no plan survives its first encounter with the enemy. That was absolutely true in spades. It wasn't until Carenton was taken that Utah Beach actually linked up with Omaha. If you've seen Band of Brothers, you can recognize the issues involved for landing the 101st Airborne, and Colonel Winter, it was Captain Winters at the time, helping to secure various areas. There's that town of St. Mary-Glise, which we'll talk about very briefly in a moment. In fact, we'll talk about it right now. When Gina and I were visiting Normandy on the anniversary of the invasion, June 5-6 is when we were there. If you go to St. Mary-Glise, the paratroopers landed, a good number landed right in the town. And there's a famous scene in the movie D-Day, The Longest Day, where Red Buttons gets trapped. Not here, but actually got trapped back here. But they have a mannequin hanging there from the church. Now, we're going to hit the beaches sequentially from west to east. Utah Beach was actually, for the Americans, one of the better places to land, even though it was separated from Omaha Beach by a considerable distance and involved a lot of poor terrain. This is all marsh. The paratroopers had landed in many of these areas, but had been scattered terribly. And instead of the entirety of the 4th Division landing across a beach area of this site, they ended up getting shifted by currents and landed on a very narrow site. Again, in the movie The Longest Day, Roosevelt, that's the son of Teddy Roosevelt, says we'll start the war from here. This is just a blow up. The terrain is very difficult. The objective, get across the marshes and get across the Meredith River and the Douve River here, take the town of Carrington, go west a bit and east and try to connect up with Omaha Beach. Fortunately for the United States, troops landing there, casualties were not too severe. I'll see if I can keep this thing from closing. We'll see if it's here. If not, we'll not fuss over it. Okay. This is one of the emplacements that was built by the Germans to defend various areas along the beach. This is at Pointe du Hoc, which was an outcropping that when you were there, you could look to your left and to your right and literally look for miles to see where things were, and constructed in such a way to withstand heavy artillery fire from naval ships or even air bombardment. That didn't mean that the naval bombardments weren't effective. You could destroy a good part of things, but you'll notice the amount of shell fire it takes and the layers of concrete that are here reinforced make it very difficult to take. Now,
Well, they weren't fully provisioned.
no, and that was the reason they could take them.
Yeah.
Again, that's in that movie, The Longest Day, that shows that. Tom Hanks isn't there.
If
He's
you're standing on Pointe du Hoc and you look down 110 feet,
right.
you wonder how those boys
Yep.
and young men did it.
They actually did a reenactment with young Army soldiers. I think they may have been Rangers, but I'm not sure of that. Shortly before we were there, they actually climbed up to show how difficult it was, even with
And nobody was
modern
shooting at
training. And nobody was shooting at you. Omaha Beach, we've all heard about as being the American catastrophe of sorts. Certainly, we took our heaviest casualties there. But I wanted to point this out to you because of the following issues. First, low water, high water, 18-foot change in the depth of the water. Notice the distance, 300 yards from low to high water. You get to the shingle, which is a few yards wide. It looks overexpanded here. It's really very short compared to this. And then you have another open shelf of 200 yards faced by 100 to 170 foot cliff. And you're going to go across that. And here are some of the defensive works that are there. And this explains why you had to know the tides. Because many of these structures had mines attached to them. So if your boat hit it, you blow up if you can't see it. So you do it low tide in order to try to see where these obstacles are, clear them, and allow your landing craft to get ashore without blowing up. But the tide is going to come in as well. So depending upon how long it takes you to get off the beach, that water is going to be coming up to you. And I talked about that when we invaded Tarawa. Again, sort of at low tide and then at high tide, and you see different pictures, and they literally, right at the seawall, had water up to their boots. When you got to the shingle, this is sandy, this is shale, there's a wall, and then wire beyond it. You have to be prepared to breach all of that. Again, very complex, because you know that guys up here are going to have a nice line of fire down there. And if 1,000 yards looks like a long distance for us, it's not when you've got a heavy machine gun or a mortar or even a light cannon. You can do enormous amounts of damage. So you got to figure out how you're going to get through all that. And there are some issues historically that bring that out. This is a picture of the beach when Gene and I were there. This in the background, you strip away all of the foliage. The Germans cleared all that. So there'd be no obstruction to their line of sight, and therefore no obstruction to their line of fire. You're standing way out here when your landing craft drop you off. And you have to cross an open field in the face of automatic gunfire from protected installations on the heights. If any of you have ever been to Fredericksburg during the Civil War and realize what happened to the Union troops when they tried to attack Marie's Heights and were faced with a sunken road, it was utter devastation to the Union forces. But this is what they faced coming off their landing craft. All this up here, those guys are looking at you saying, here they come, we're ready for them. Now, why were they there and relatively untouched? Remember, I alluded to the issues of timing. It turns out that the bombers that were supposed to hit Omaha Beach were off delayed by a few seconds. And because they were delayed, instead of their bombs registering along here, they dropped inland. Naval gunfire proved insufficient. And it wasn't until these guys fought their way across, bodies all over the place, destroyed vehicles, and so on, that they were able to secure themselves just even on the shingle. This is another view from up on top of the bluffs. The tide's already coming in. Back then, you might have started out here. And again, you're just a target. This shows an example of guys struggling through the surf, trying to get ashore, the hedgehogs that are there, destruction all around you. Now, the landings, this is where Tom Hanks came in. Okay, the Rangers actually attacked at that particular spot. Drove inland, but by early to mid-morning, they were still in segments and far from linking up the beaches to one particular spot. But as the time rolled on, and now I want you to notice this, this is the shingle. This is high tide. Notice the landing craft and other ships that are out there. These guys were coming in on a rubber boat. It got overturned. They struggled in the surf. They just came out and they were utterly exhausted by the time they got there. And the only reason these guys could help them was because by then, the United States troops had been able to gain the heights. And then when you're crossing the beach, trying to join up with your units, this is what you see. There's been a lot of criticism in some histories about the United States not listening to the British about having tanks land with the initial wave. They actually had tanks and they launched them, but they were too far out in the heavy surf, and many of them simply sank. Of the ones that made it to shore, they were quickly knocked out by anti-tank fire from the Germans. So it wasn't as though they weren't paying attention. Now, what about the British? Interestingly, the United States had 2 beaches. The British Commonwealth had 3. This is gold. To the east of the Omaha Beach shows you the defensive structures all along here with various artillery emplacements. And that again, they concentrated their effort here, but the idea was to sweep out to the east and west and drive all the way down to Cone, which is not even on the map. But notice the scale of miles, all right? From here to here, maybe 1.5 miles at most 2, not a big penetration. But once they had secured the heights, they could bring a lot of people in. Now, what I want you to notice here, you think they're just ducking because of gunfire? They're all standing around. Juneau was the next beach to the east. Similar kind of effect, though much lighter resistance. As you see, enemy fire and mines, but they were again able to penetrate fairly deeply, but they still had not reached their first day's objective, though they were close. And the final beach to the east was Sword. And in this situation, British paratroopers, the 6th Parachute Division, had landed here near something called the Pegasus Bridge, an important bridge over the waterway. Gene and I were there, got to see it. I don't think I have a picture of it. But literally, they had a glider land within about 50 yards of the bridge. Came in silently, and you could see the markings that were there, and took the bridge and held it until they could be relieved. Now, remember I talked about logistics. What happens? How do you build up? Again, had to consider the high water line, low water line. There's no port here. Everything has to come across the beach. So what do? You create your own port. They designed a thing called the mulberries. They had ships that literally were filled with concrete, and they would sink them out in the water to act as a breakwater. And then they would develop piers, which they would bring in and press out so that ships could land and offload, because some of them couldn't get to the beaches. These aren't all LSTs, as they were called, where you could get on the beach, open your doors, and everybody runs out. Nope, these were the big transports. And in addition, not shown here, is they created a pipeline under the water from England to the coast of France to bring in the petrol that they needed to run their vehicles. That's how complex this situation was just to get ashore. And as you can see from this, they also were concerned about the German Air Force. Turned out that was non-existent in terms of showing up over the battlefield. But look at the vehicles. You have to make sure all of them have what they need to keep going. You have to get them off a sandy beach. You have to get them where there's no real road up through these draws onto higher ground. You have to prepare for all of that. So you begin to see how enormously complex this is, and that the generals were less concerned about the tactics of fighting, although that was an issue lower down, than they were about how do you sustain it. The cost, Well, you go to the American Cemetery and it's an impressive view. Now, these are not all people who were killed on D-Day. These people are here from into July. But it demonstrates to you the enormous cost. And I have to say, when Gina and I were there, the French people on the commemorative day would bring a sort of golden sand and wet it, and they would rub it on the faces of the crosses so that it left the sand in that imprint. It wasn't just carved out. And you can see how well cared for this is. Casualties, again, gives you an idea of the cost involved. Notice that Omaha Beach had the worst tally of all, but it gives you an idea that this wasn't nothing. And if we look at the total casualties, the estimates are roughly equal, which is a tribute to the support, fire support the Allies had. Any questions at this point? You know, I'd have to skip over so many details, but because we're familiar with Normandy, the invasion, I wanted to have this, you know, really drilled into. All set? I'll tell you what, let's take a short break because the next segments are going to flow fairly quickly, and it's difficult to stop it in just another 10 minutes. Let's just take until 10 up and go from there, right? And then get coffee, bathroom, whatever.
I wish to respectfully disagree with you.
Okay.
The destruction of Constantinople. Hagia Sophia, which was the iconic structure,
Right,
and it built in 600 AD,
right.
survived that.
Yes, but it was turned into a mosque.
Eventually turned into a mosque. But at the time, Mehmet came through that back door that was left open
Mhm.
for him, that Constantinople was mostly a series of small villages behind a wall. It wasn't what we would consider a city, and most of it was left. It was not raised to any extent.
No, I don't mean it in terms of a physical destruction where things were raised. This isn't Carthage being taken by Scipio.
Or Atlanta taken by the Union.
Well, they didn't raise it entirely, and some of the burning of Atlanta was, yes, they torched it themselves. The idea is that the culture, the economy, the social structure, the moral codes all disappeared. So the people who lived there had an amazing transformation of their lives. All of the structure of their lives was completely upended. And that's part of what I'm trying to create in terms of that narrative.
But when you look at physical destruction,
Oh, yeah.
800 or 900 planes physically destroyed Germany, and we can do it with 3.
Yep.
Yeah,
Or
we
one big one.
I'm better at it.
We have indeed. Yes, indeed. And that raises a whole lot of other questions that we might deal with in the fall, depending on events between now and then. I have those 3 sessions scheduled. I don't know if you've seen yet. I don't know. We don't have the fall calendar
I
out
haven't
yet.
seen the fall panel.
Yeah.
But if you're doing the phone book, that's not enough for it.
They also had a number of prisoners of war they'd captured in the East who joined the German army for a variety of reasons, part of which was just to get out of an internment camp and not be starving to death. So some of them were occupying the defenses. But even if you're not a hard-bred Nazi, which, you know, they weren't. In fact, most of the soldiers were not dyed-in-the-wool Nazis per se. It's easy if you're sitting behind a trench or in a placement and you have a machine gun and they tell you to just shoot anybody coming at you, because if they come at you, they're going to kill you. And there's a scene again in The Longest Day where a guy walks in, he bit, and he shoots him. What does bit mean?
The Normandy cemetery in terms of maintenance was not all that unusual. The Luxembourg cemetery and Nice.
I haven't seen those.
Well, I had to go see one Patton was buried.
Yeah, yeah. Awesome though.
Not quite as immaculate.
Yeah.
So the distribution east to west of the forces essentially determined at Normandy, determined like the north.
Correct.
So the army, so it was foreordained that the British would be.
Right. But what's interesting is to remember that the British had been fighting for 5 years. And yet they were given 3 beaches to handle. And again, Montgomery changes his description of why they were there as opposed to being elsewhere. And part of it was logistics and mobility. The US had much greater mobility than the British did. But he wanted to draw the German armored forces against him, where he felt he could defeat them, crush them, as he had, say, at El Alamein. The problem was that was perhaps a retrospective, because they had hoped to cut the Caen Bayou Road on day 1 and never got there for, I think, 6 weeks. But indeed, he was correct. And when you look at that map, you'll see a heavy concentration of German armor here that finally gets released by Hitler when he realizes ultimately that there is no other landing. This is it.
The distribution of the staging of the forces in England. Was that reflected in the distribution at Normandy, where the Americans?
Oh, I see what you mean.
The West?
Yeah, yeah. And again, that way you don't have people crossing lines, and you can kind of, and it goes back to that slide that shows the transport routes. And the transport routes, when you look carefully at the slide, you can see the names of which organization was tasked with that, not at the division level, but at the corps level. Otherwise, you have too many lines. It's bad enough as it is.
It's interesting that the decisions made early on where to put the
Right.
kind of decided years later where they end up in Europe.
Yes,
right?
yes. And we'll come to that when we talk about this expansion to break out. We'll see a bit of that happen.
But Patton's Third Army.
He's still in England.
Yeah, but the Third Army was placed separate. It was to the east.
It was placed to the east because they wanted the Germans to pick up all that radio traffic and look at Calais, because the Germans had great respect for Patton.
Yes.
They didn't quite understand why slapping a soldier would make a difference, you know, from their standpoint, you just shoot him. Yeah, you know, you misbehaved, you shoot the bastard. So they were nonplussed. They said, oh, okay. They're just trying to make us think he's not going to be important. But then we see this gathering and we know that he's got the potential.
You could be into the fifth army there. Where was the real Third Army?
Well, it was created a bit further to the west, so that all the radio traffic and a lot of the dummy stuff, dummy tanks and airplanes and all the rest of it, were concentrated more to the eastern side. So if any German reconnaissance planes got through, which actually practically none ever did, they would see that and say, oh, gosh, you know, they are building up here, whereas over there, not quite the same. There's a whole book on the deception that took place. And it's a fascinating read if you're into that kind of thing. Okay, folks, we'll keep forging ahead here. But again, if there are any questions that any of you have, feel free to not ask. Okay, let me just scroll down here for a minute and we'll get back on track. Okay. So what happens from June 6th until almost the middle of July? This is almost hard to fathom again, because we think of the World War II as a huge war of mass maneuvers, North Africa, the Russians and the Eastern Front, the Germans and the Eastern Front, all this maneuvering all over the place. And here you are with a 50-mile wide beach that is stuck there for almost 6 weeks with not a great deal of improvement. Now, some improvement does occur because the Americans drive further west, cut off the Cotentin Peninsula, and eventually take the port of Cherbourg. Cherbourg was defended heavily. The port was severely damaged. It didn't become useful for a whole number of weeks. But this was roughly the expansion that you see after even just 3 weeks of fighting. Very, very tough terrain to get through. You've heard of the hedgerows. I'll show you a picture of that in a little bit. This is, again, just a blow up of that to give you a little better idea of the enormous support that is brought in to continue this fighting over weeks. Everything has to come by ship. Everything has to land across the beaches. But in the middle of June, a terrible storm strikes and destroys almost entirely one of the American-based mulberries, as they were called, damages but leaves largely intact the British one. And I'm saying nothing about the discussion and disagreements that continued to roil the high command with the British and Americans. Montgomery had been placed in charge, you'll see here his 21st Army Group, of all of the ground forces in order to have a unified command structure. Bradley had the 1st Army, Dempsey had the 2nd, and Carrera would come in later with his. This gives you an idea of the hedgerows. Sunken roads to some extent, built up mounds, heavy hedges across with an open field between the hedges. Think of walking out into a field surrounded by trees at about 200-yard distance, and you've got to cross that. And somebody on the other side has a machine gun or a rifle or whatever, and he's just waiting for you to appear. And you can't maneuver tanks very well here because the hedges are so difficult. This is where something came into play. An American sergeant, showing a little bit of creativity, welded a plow onto the front of a Sherman tank. Just think of a big, one that was not a backhoe, but a plow with a great big thing in front of it. And they could drive that in and knock this dirt and hedge out of the way. Sounds like a solution, except you've created a gap, sure. But the guys on the other side are saying, oh, there's the doorway. Guess who's coming to dinner? And if you have some even relatively light anti-tank weapon, a 37mm or something of that sort, you can punch a hole in that tank, especially if you're hitting it from the side. So again, this is all about guts. This is all about taking it on the chin, but getting up and keeping at it. Eventually, solutions were developed after a whole series of failures to break the German line. And the discussion centered around the following. We have all these bombers, heavy bombers, B-17s, Lancasters, the rest of them, all capable of carrying many tons of ordnance. why don't we just do something similar to World War I? What did we do in World War I? We used artillery, sometimes for days, to pummel the defenders. And by destroying them with artillery fire, that would allow our troops to advance. Except they forgot a lesson. You tear up the ground, you make it miserable, it becomes very hard to advance. But we've got airplanes. So they developed a thing called the bomb box. 7 by 3 kilometers. Now just think of the distances involved there. That's not great. And if you're flying an airplane at 200, 225, or even 250 miles an hour, and you clock out how many seconds you can travel, or you clock out a mile or 2 miles or 3 miles, how long does it take you? If your timing is off, what's going to happen? Well, the first bomb box they tried certainly devastated the area. The German defenders who were stuck there really felt it badly. A lot of them killed, wounded, just disoriented, concussed. But the ground was so torn up that the armor couldn't advance. Oh, that didn't work. Well, we know that old adage, if at first you don't succeed, try again. So this time, let's do it with even more bombers. But maybe we'll use lighter bombs so they don't tear up the ground quite so much. Now, 2 questions rise immediately. From which direction should the aircraft arrive? Should they arrive from the north, or either from the east or the west? Thoughts? What would you choose?
East and west.
Okay. Now, you think of the depth. That's about 1.5 miles, maybe at most 2 miles. You're going to bring this many aircraft in. How much distance does each plane take? How much separation between each plane? How many planes will it take to cover this area? So the Air Force rejected that, said, we can't do that. If we're flying in like that, we have to have such a narrow bomber stream that it's almost impossible to control it and regulate it. We need a broader one. So they decided to come from the north. What's the problem there? Your target is not very deep. Bomb release, especially at, say, 10,000 feet, you time how long it takes a bomb to leave your aircraft on that diagonal slope to hit the ground. Timing is everything, because if you release too soon, who's there?
Us.
Right. And indeed, that's what happened. And General Leslie McNair was killed in the process. Now, he was there as an observer, but he had been of senior importance in training American soldiers. This is in Station 45 restaurant. He's killed on the 26th. I don't know that he was killed in the bombing attack. 2 brothers also served. You look at us nowadays, it's 22. So when this happened, eventually, though, the bombing proved effective enough that in Operation Cobra, and Greg brought something here to show you if you want to look at that afterward, that eventually Bradley's troops could break through and begin to fully expand the bridgehead. And this is a more dramatic example. Now, Montgomery is still in charge, but now he has Carrar's 1st and Dempsey's 2nd. Bradley is here with the 1st Army, and another army is going to arrive soon under a guy named George Patton. And that 3rd Army is going to press against that far western flank of the Germans and force them away. And this is an example of what happens as this whole front collapses. The Germans who are here are largely centered around the ports. They're going to hang on to them. But if they're mobile troops, they're going to try to get out. So for the period of time between the 26th of July and just 3 weeks later, the Allies have expanded a bridgehead from this to control all of that. But they're still a little bit behind schedule. And Hitler is not done. He's going to launch a counterattack here at Mortain to try to cut this small gap and sever the connection between the troops down here, which now comprise Patton's Third Army, and the rest of the beaches up further north. He's unable to accomplish that task. The Americans who held that area are not a big, powerful group by any means. Were able to stop the German assault. And in this blow-up picture, you'll notice something else. We talked about these a lot on the Eastern Front. This is the development of a pocket. The Germans often called them a cauldron or kessel, where the troops inside could be punished badly from either side. The Canadians are driving down towards the town of Falaise. The Americans have turned up and taken Argenton. And it looks like it's time to seal that off and destroy that German 7th Army. It's going to be caught. Only it doesn't happen. And it doesn't happen for a variety of reasons, part of which was concern over friendly fire. Part of it was caution, just sheer caution. And this is one of the things that created enormous tension between some of the American leaders, such as Patton in particular, who was as aggressive as anyone could ever be, sometimes to his own detriment. But the Germans managed to escape, losing nearly all their heavy equipment and about 50,000 prisoners. I want you to think of that number for a moment again. And when we come to the Eastern Front, it'll be even more significant because the numbers are so much greater. It's hard to take it into account. But within a period of just about 2 weeks, the Germans lost the equivalent of the entire city of Binghamton. Every man, woman, and child here, gone. Now, they went to internment camps, fortunately, and a lot of them survived. But the point is they are removed from your roster. The French also have landed, and again, creates great tension, but also due to the introduction of the Third Army and then the consolidation of Patton's Third with Hodges' First, Bradley is now moved up to an Army group commander as opposed to just an Army commander. Montgomery still remains in charge of the ground forces. Eisenhower is in charge of everything, but this will change in a little bit. And the French join the Americans here, French 2nd Armored Division, to enter Paris. There's a book called Is Paris Burning?
Yeah.
You may have heard about it. Von Kolitz was the German general in charge. He refused to burn the city. The French partisans in the city rose up. There were some minor battles, but fortunately the city was protected and preserved. Now, the onrush is that enormous distances are being covered in a relatively short time, but there aren't any gas stations, at least none of any sort, and certainly no electric charging stations. Not an issue for them, fortunately, at that time. But the importance is that you have to supply these troops. Food, water should be not a big problem. Ammunition, clothing, medical support, radio communications, all the munitions that are involved of different calibers, from small arms to artillery pieces and on and on and on. So what does this mean? You're outrunning your ability to supply. And in the movie Patton, he talks about that. Literally siphoning gasoline from some tanks to fill others so they could continue to forge ahead. That's how aggressive he was. If it meant I have to leave 2 tanks behind in order to have 1 tank go forward, I want that tank going forward. July through August. Again, look at the numbers and consider, especially the German casualties. 400 to 450,000. This is just in weeks. Just weeks. So we begin to find ourselves contemplating today's responses to casualty figures, tossing out a million in 3 years of combat for the Russians in Ukraine and maybe a comparable number of Ukrainians. Not to be disparaged, but what I'm trying to point out is this. The resiliency of modern civilizations, modern societies, to conduct war is enormous. It is profound and deep, especially if you are willing to use means which most of us on a sort of moral and personal level would want to reject. But forcing people to fight, because the alternatives are you might get shot by your own side for refusing to fight, something the Russians did with great commonness. It's estimated that in the Battle of Stalingrad, the NKVD, like the German Gestapo, may have executed as many as 50,000. A number, again, hard to contemplate. But the point is that modern societies can dig very deep into what they have as resources. So despite this, the Germans are not giving up. Now, the front expands considerably, but as it expands, as I mentioned, the logistical support becomes very, very difficult. And Eisenhower's primary job in looking at the logistical structure is not just creating the infrastructure to bring things forward, but the allocation, who gets what. And at some point, the crunch comes when he has to select one group rather than another. He's got to tell the others, you got to hold in place, or you can't advance this far because I can't support you. And if you're caught out there with no support, you're in big trouble. In addition, another event takes place, and that is southern France is invaded. Why? Well, the attack, and we'll talk about this briefly when we come to Italy in a subsequent lecture. The advantages in Italy had really been consumed already by drawing German resources to defend the peninsula. Strategically, Italy didn't offer the Allies a great deal, except tying down German resources. So there was a decision made, which Churchill resisted, to invade southern France, taking some units from Italy and bringing them in the south, because they felt that if they could do that, they would open the ports of, say, Marseille and Toulon, which would allow them to bring in more supplies, a shorter distance perhaps, and might trap Germans who were still in the southwest of France trying to get out as the front up north collapses. This particular slide just shows, and again, this goes all the way to December, but the point I want to make are these lines that you're seeing here, all right? And this is actually, they planned to be here in about a month, and they weren't even close. They were going to land here, come up the Rhone Valley, and all the Germans here would have to get out through this narrowing gap that we see here in order to reach the German border because they can't go into Switzerland. The Swiss did not like people tromping on their territory.
Michael? So much of what you hear on World War II was a war in the Atlantic. Which of the two fronts was tasked with taking the submarine pens that were on the
At
Bay of
Navarre,
Biscay?
you're thinking about Navarre, I think is one
Navarre.
of the pens. They were in the Brittany area and they were to be taken over a ground assault, if you will, but
Yeah.
the garrisons there were basically strong enough, and Patton and Bradley in cooperation decided they would just isolate them. By this time, 1944, the German submarine attacks had been beaten back by the structures that had been created in the Atlantic with escort carriers, increased number of escorts with convoys, sub-hunting techniques, and even using radar in airplanes.
So
that
it
they
wasn't
could
that
use.
much of a problem anymore.
Correct. And once those are cut off, the Germans can't supply them. So if they're going to supply them, they got to get them back somehow to Germany. And of course, they can't cross the channel because that's just filled with stuff that's going to take them out. Similarly, they couldn't really go anywhere in the Mediterranean, though they still held Greece. And, you know, the Balkan areas there was just nothing for them there either. So whatever was left in those ports just sat there. Or you took one last mission. What this demonstrates is that they were still, the Allies were still able to consolidate enough force with the complexities involved that you see here to create a Seventh Army under Patch and invade southern France. And very quickly, you'll see the German defenders here in division strength, 19th Army under Weiss. The Blaskowitz was in charge of the theater. But very quickly begin their drive up and show that the terrain here, which the Germans had occupied, they'd have to cross tough terrain to get out of there. Most of them made it. Hitler, while he resisted retreats, was finally coming to the conclusion there are certain battles you have to just avoid. And this isn't one where you're going to siphon off enough people to do it. It was called Operation Dragoon. Churchill says he was dragooned into it. He wanted to go in the Balkans. But if you think about where the Balkans are in relationship to where the primary American forces are, they're a long way away with very difficult terrain. So sustaining that would not work from their perspective. And some probably remembered World War I with a place called Salonika, where now called Thessalonica. It's in the eastern portion of Greece, where 100,000 Allied troops sat in what the Germans themselves called one of the biggest self-sustaining prisoner of war camps we've ever had. And nothing happened until very late in the war that they were able to break out. So the Allies had memory, right? They weren't bereft of this stuff. They knew what was going on, Churchill aside. And he had plenty of great ideas. He had some terrible ideas. And even his chief of staff, Sir Alan Brooke, used to say his biggest job was to keep Churchill on point. Yes.
What was the total size of the German army?
They were still running about 3 million. They had roughly 1.5 million after the collapse with Operation Bagration, which destroyed Army Group Center. But they were still able to muster that muster, and they put almost 1 million together still in the West. But a lot of these were relatively untrained. The veterans, many had all been killed. Yes.
What was the total population of Germany?
Before the war started, it was roughly 65 million. Soviet Union, about 190 million. United States was about 160. British Commonwealth's hard to judge because depended on who you wanted to include, you know, the Indian nation or whatever. Yes.
Churchill was noted for taking the long and very long point of view. And had we gone into the Balkans, perhaps the post-war negotiations and picture of how Europe evolved would have become significantly different.
We're going to talk about that in one of the subsequent lectures, because that's one of the key issues, and it also affects how Eisenhower conducted the rest of the fighting in the West. Got to clear out France. 7th Army is down here. The Germans are escaping, trying to get back up into Germany proper. The 7th Army is going to come up and eventually join up, as you see this line beginning to approach this line. The Low Countries, called that for a good reason, don't have difficult terrain except that it's often marshy, crisscross rivers and canals, things of this sort that are a greater impediment than the ground itself. No real mountainous terrain, but if you look at one of the maps I brought, you can see that there's a lot of mountainous terrain that's here and here. This is just, again, a close-up view to give you an idea of the German concentration, the resistance that's developing. One of the key elements here, this guy, Model, was known as Hitler's fire brigade. He was sent to the places that were considered the greatest threatened areas. He was a defensive specialist, whatever that really meant. I'm still not sure I understand it. But interestingly, Rundstedt had been brought back after his up and down relationships with Hitler. And you could ask yourself, and this is true of every conflict you might read about, why are some of these guys as generals demoted and then promoted? Civil War, Joe Johnson, right? You know, in and out and in and out, and Bragg, in and out. Why did they keep these guys? Because there's much more to what they do than just telling this unit goes here, this unit goes there. That's what I tried to get at in terms of talking about Normandy itself. Montgomery clears the lowlands, and he's thinking, what is the major barrier in front of us before we can get into Germany proper? It's the Rhine River. Gene and I have sailed down that, and it's a formidable place. You know, it's not something you wade across. It's not like the Susquehanna in August, right? You're not getting across that easily. He sees an opportunity to get up here, and if he can take Antwerp as an example, he can open up another major port that will shorten these supply lines. Now, what about these particular ports? They're helpful, but the Germans certainly aren't going to let them go back intact. They're going to blow up anything they can, which means as part of your planning as the senior staff, how do I repair the ports? What do I need? Cranes, I need steel, I need people who can put it all together. I have to arrange for those people to come in with their supplies. That's how complicated this whole thing gets. Montgomery pitches a plan. Patton had also pitched a plan and said, no, you give me the supplies and I'll drive into Germany. And that takes him out of the logistical support system. You see, coming across here, where are your supplies coming from? But if we take this up here, the supply lines suddenly are shortened by hundreds of miles. And what about air support? I still have a lot of aircraft in England. They can reach there easier than they can reach here. So you have these different tactical considerations that go with it as well. As the coast is cleared, and I just shifted this to a detail just to show you that the French also now create an army. The French B, de Tassigny, I think was the leader. This gets de Gaulle into the political and military mix, which is not fun for anybody, including de Gaulle. It's hardly understandable, his position and desires, but boy, does he create a mess. There's one point where he actually threatens to keep the French forces out of the fight. At which point Eisenhower says to him, "You do that, we're cutting off all your supplies. You'll get nothing." So if you really want to go that route, you're going to take it on the chin, sort of like a tariff. Sorry, couldn't resist, whatever. So Montgomery's plan, Operation Market Garden, is a single thrust, one focus to the north to get to the Rhine River and cross the Rhine on a bridge that he hopes to capture with air paratroopers and glider troops at a place called Arnhem. There is a very good movie with some oddities called A Bridge Too Far, based on Cornelius Ryan's book. It's an excellent read, and it's a pretty decent movie for a whole lot of things. What does it involve? On a very narrow sector, this line is 20 miles, okay? So think about the width and the distance. Here's Nijmegen, here's Arnhem, Eindhoven is another key spot. Unfortunately, the terrain on either side of this main highway is very marshy, and you can see all of the different blue lines that are present that you have to cross on bridges. And you have to assume that some of those bridges are going to be blown up by the Germans before you can take them. So you have to bring bridging equipment. But if you're on a narrow line of force, you don't have a big width with a lot of roads. You've only got a few that'll carry the weight of an armor vehicle, a tank or things of that sort. You're going to be confined to the road. Where do you put the bridging equipment? If you put it too far forward, you get blown up by the defenders. If you put it too far back, then there's a great delay of clearing the roadway and trying to get that equipment up so you can cross the thing. Yes.
How would you describe the influence that the French resistance had in all this?
Overblown. I don't mean to disparage the courage. Frankly, when I've ever thought of myself in that situation, I'm terrified and I just have to run to the bathroom. The courage was great. The impact, at best, modest. Yes, they disrupted railroads. Yes, they blew up telegraph lines and things of that sort. But in terms of actually creating the kind of issues that the Germans faced in Russia with the partisans, not a comparison. The partisan activity in the East was enormous by comparison. So in this regard, 30 Corps under Horrocks, which is primarily an armor corps, is to drive up this road, breaking the defenses that otherwise should have been disrupted by the paratroopers. The paratroopers are going to land here, the 101st, the 82nd, and the British Red Devils are going to end up there, the 1st British Paratroop Division. And again, the movie is excellent in depicting a lot of what happened at that time. They were so numerous that one of the German generals actually witnessing these guys descending. Never snows in September because the white parachutes. They were successful insofar as the Americans were able to capture some of the bridges, but most of them actually were wrecked. And there's a scene there, whereas just as they're approaching a bridge over a canal, the thing blows up in their faces. In addition, unbeknownst, or at least unaccepted by the high command, was that there were 2 Panzer divisions resting and recuperating around Arnhem. In the movie, these are seen and mentioned, But what is not mentioned, and so it makes it seem as though the British High Command was stupid or uncaring, was this: what are you going to do about it? You either cancel the operation, the whole purpose of which is to get that bridge, or you go for it in spite of it, and you provide what support you can to make them successful. But you're stretching the range of fighter bombers and other things of that nature, so it becomes a difficult issue. So again, I wouldn't be too harsh on the British High Command in spite of what the movie says. This just, again, is a blow up. It shows how restricted the road networks were, the importance of bridges, all of which could be blown up at some time or another. This bridge was captured intact due to a screw up of the electrical system that was supposed to blow it. And the Allies were literally, and it's in the movie again, you see the tanks crossing while the guy's trying to blow them up while the tanks are on the bridge, which of course would be what you'd want. Get them while they're on the bridge. Eventually, the British 1st Parachute Division is completely cut off. There's a bit of salvage that takes place. That's also in Band of Brothers, where some people can swim across or get across the Rhine River, but most of them aren't. And the bridge here was kept by the Germans. This is subsequent, of course, but shows the destruction that occurred all around the fighting that happened. Again, very well portrayed in the movie as to what that fighting was like. But this took us through September. And at this point now, the Allies have gotten Antwerp, but there's a problem. This area is still held by the Germans, which means you can't get your guys supplies in there yet. You have to take that. Walcheren Island is one of the main islands here, right here. And that takes a whole different operation because you actually have to have landing craft to get there. It's just not possible to walk into it. And it's defended heavily. So it takes a while for that to happen. And while that's going on, you've consumed a great many supplies to get you all the way almost there. But then these have stalled to some extent. And as Marseille and Toulon and other places open up, now you can begin to resuscitate those central armies, the 7th, the 3rd, the 5th, 1st, and so on, and begin to move forward. And at this point, Eisenhower has moved to the continent, and he's taken over Montgomery's command of ground forces, and he's allocated Montgomery to an army group commander and Bradley to the other army group commander, and then Devers takes over as the reinforcements pour in through southern France.
How do you withdraw the paratroopers if the attack fails? So
You don't.
Do they just walk out or they're captured?
They were captured and killed. So they had I think there were 6,000 casualties in the division. And that doesn't include those who were captured. I think only about 1,000 or 2 got out.
Of the British or also?
Of the British. No, the Americans were relieved. They hung on. So Horrocks was able to reach Eindhoven, go up past Udengrav and up to Nijmegen. It was costly. And this was one of the things that paratroopers are supposed to be able to sustain themselves for about 3 days max. The British were up there for 2 weeks. They had some transports come in and drop things to them. Again, in the movie, there's a container in which they all have help, cloth hats. Guy goes out to pick it up, comes running back and gets killed, and he drops, and the canister opens all hats. Where'd that come from? Right. The drive north continues. There's gradual attacks that take place. These now become grinding attacks. These are not fast maneuvers. And that has to do with the increasing difficulty of the terrain, as it's highlighted by the brownish coloring that you see. And this represents the West Wall, built around the time of World War I and then upgraded during the 20s and 30s, and then largely ignored as much of the artillery and other equipment there was shifted to the Eastern Front. But it still was an obstacle. It still would require a careful assault to take place. And again, it gives the defenders an advantage because they're protected in ways that the attackers aren't. But the Allies were making progress. This just shows the direction of Market Garden, the intent to get all the way up to Arnhem. And it gives you an idea of the amount of terrain that had been taken. So now here you are, middle to late September. You'd started down here in the beginning of June. So once you broke this impasse, there was an enormous amount of movement in just a few weeks, the war of maneuvering. But then you run up against a brick wall again, and you now are stuck. The weather begins to deteriorate. Everybody's linked up now from the Swiss border all the way to the English Channel, a la World War I. All right, not as heavily fortified as were the entrenchments then. But nonetheless, the infrastructure to keep all this functioning had to be built. You may have heard of the Red Ball Express. It was a truck system driven largely by Negro soldiers, if I remember correctly. And they would transport material from the beaches and then as different places were opened to the front lines in trucks, but trucks consume fuel. So you have a limited range. If you use up all your fuel getting somewhere, you have to be refueled in order to go back. Where do you get your fuel from? Well, you just brought it. So you have to consume some of what you brought. You see, it's all of that peculiarity that we have to keep in mind. And the train systems had been largely wrecked, not so much by the partisans, though they contributed, but by Allied bombing. So if you want to resurrect the train systems, you have to have all the stuff and the people to build that. Oh, but then you need locomotives and you need rail cars. And you have to have somebody who can figure out what goes in what rail car and where it's going, and so on, and so on, and so on. So up to this particular moment, the fighting for the Allies becomes very, very intense. The fighting around Aachen and Schmidt is particularly destructive. Heavy, heavy fighting. The Germans certainly were not in the mind of giving up. I skipped over one other very important thing that happened in July 20.
Assassination attempt.
Exactly. Hitler is in a conference room with a number of his senior generals. You remember the guy who brought it in? Yep. Brings in a briefcase with a bomb, sticks it under the table. Hitler's leaning on the table. Bomb goes off. Hitler survives because of that table. It was a heavy oak table. But in this, and the building itself had wooden walls, if I remember correctly. So as the bomb exploded, it blew the walls out. If it had been in a concrete bunker, it probably would have killed everybody in there just from concussion. But it certainly created plenty of difficulty for him. But on top of it, Operation Valkyrie was an attempt to take over various important locations in Berlin and announce that Hitler was dead and now there was a new government. That fell apart very quickly. A number of senior generals were found out to have conspired in this, were taken to trial, such is the case, and executed. A coup attempt failed miserably. But what this did was harden two things: Hitler's belief that he was going to win ultimately. Otherwise, I would have died. Does that sound like somebody we've heard recently? And secondly, opposition is wrecked. There is no one who can oppose me. If you oppose me, you literally are dead. I don't have to try you anymore. I just send someone out to shoot you and your family. So he doesn't have the opposition anymore. So what does this mean about surrendering? It's off the table entirely from the German perspective. All right. And in terms of the propaganda that occurs, as we'll come to in subsequent lecture, there's yet another, I'll call it disastrous step of sorts that the Americans make. It's on our shoulders, but I will talk about it at a later date. So by the middle of December, with the weather deteriorating, not a lot of progress. The British and Canadians have taken a big nosebleed, not just from Operation Market Garden, but from finally clearing the Scheldt, Beveland, freeing up Antwerp. But it's been difficult. And remember, the British manpower reserves are markedly diminished after 5 years of fighting. And they're still involved with a lot of Commonwealth troops, Australians and Indians in particular, in the East, the Far East. So it looks as though there's time for a rest. Time to take a little bit of a breather, let the weather moderate a little bit. And in one of the locations down here under First Army, we have a little place, the Ardennes, which is thought to be a nice, when I use the word rest, all that means is you're not out there launching attack after attack. You have patrols, you're trying to engage the enemy, you're trying to figure out what's going on. You want to get new recruits in and get them, understanding a little bit of what combat is like and things of that sort before they're asked to really get into it. This just shows some of the progress that was made. I'll go past that fairly quickly. In the interim, despite all the damage the Germans have taken, in spite of the encroachments that are coming from the east as well, which we'll get to in another lecture, Hitler is by no means ready to quit. In fact, he decides that he is going to attack. Now, most of us would think if you've been rocked back on your heels and you're struggling, do you want to attack? But what's one of the things that your opponent doesn't expect? You to attack him, right? Like the cornered dog or rat or whatever you want to call it, right? Or a wounded one. The last thing you want to do is to get too close and it says, I got nothing to lose here, fella. I'm taking you with me. Under great secrecy, he is able to withdraw units with a really good level of weaponry from both the Eastern Front and the Balkan region, Bulgaria, Romania area, and bring them west and put them together for an attack which he believes has the capability of cutting off a good part of the Allied army in the West and completely changing the equation that he has to face. Now, I showed this because it gives you an idea of the supplies that have to reach the front line and where they're coming. Notice that, for example, here at Granville, they get 1,100 tons a day. Here they get 6,700 at Cherbourg. But when you've got Antwerp open and finally functioning, 16,600 tons a day. All of that had to be organized and coordinated and directed. And there's more coming from the south. So logistics have to catch up. The German forces have been weakened, but they're still a long way from Berlin, that is on the Western Front. Eastern Front is beginning to crouch in. They've taken Warsaw and so on. And winter strikes, and this is one of the coldest winters in recent memory for them. Now, as you can see, it's tough going. And you'll also notice that none of that stuff is in white. Why would you want white? Well, if there's snow on the ground, you're easier to hide, right? They don't have it. And we're still struggling with winter clothes, lubricants, things of that sort. And again, in Band of Brothers, there's a good set of episodes that give you a real sense of what it was like for these men to be there at this time. And remember, when we use the word men, many of them were 18, 19. Old guys were 27, 28. So in December, in the region of the Ardennes, this is the rough proportion. And what is striking about this is the enormous power the Germans were able to concentrate in this relatively short area of interest. And on December 16th, they launch a surprise artillery bombardment, and they quickly penetrate the Allied lines. And in addition, actually isolate 2 regiments just south of a place called the Losheim Gap and force their surrender. It's one of the largest American surrenders in our history. These guys are captured. We've heard, things like Bataan and things of that sort. This was bigger in terms of just pure Americans being captured. The drive is intended to come all the way up to Namur and reach up to Antwerp. It's fanciful. The German high command told Hitler it's just not possible. We don't even have enough fuel to get there. He said, capture the fuel on the way. And there's a scene in the movie, The Battle of the Bulge, where the Germans are driving up a road trying to capture a fuel dump. And the Americans are rolling barrels of fuel down at them, setting things alight. So it's like, just setting it all on fire. So you want fuel? Here it is. Hope you can handle it. But the idea behind it is that this penetration really caught the Americans off guard. Patton had been planning to attack east into this region. When he heard what was happening here, he quickly stopped that attack. Eisenhower was forced to make a critical decision. This technically all belonged under Bradley's command here. But because of the disruption of communications, Eisenhower basically drew a line through the bulge and said, everything on the north side is going to go to Montgomery. He's going to command that area, even though nearly all the fighting forces involved are American. And Bradley's going to handle what's south. And Bradley gets hold of Patton and says, turn north, drive north. This little thing you see here, Bastogne. Why was Bastogne important? 5 roads converge, like Gettysburg. All right. We want to disrupt the movement of the German forces across an open area. Don't give it up. And the 101st Airborne ends up there. Airborne is stuck there. Not the most powerful units that you have. The Germans do very well in the beginning and drive forward, surrounding Bastogne, driving far to the west. But eventually they're stopped, they run out of fuel, things begin to deteriorate, and American and British resources are funneled to the area. So you see the shift in strength went from 500 to 1,600 tanks. And tank destroyers were about as capable as tanks. They just didn't have the armor structure, but they could hit at good distance with powerful guns. So they were really important. And you begin to see the shift in strength that takes place because the logistical infrastructure, the mobility had been incorporated into their units and into the structure of this. This shows you again a view of what's going on. Just as a quick example though, 7th Corps is brought all the way back here on the 22nd in order to reinforce this area. Again, an American corps, not a British corps. This is an American fight. By the 2nd of January, the Germans are being pushed out. Notice that we have almost 750,000 men now involved in all of that. Look at the numbers involved here. It's hard to imagine putting all that stuff together in a short period of time. Yes.
Michael, you have really understated what Patton did. He took an army headed east,
Right.
turned it 90 degrees,
Yep.
and in 3 days, under fire continually, in the dead of winter, relieved Bastogne.
Yeah. He wanted to get into Bastogne by Christmas. He actually got there a day late, but he said he got there on Christmas.
An
Christmas
amazing
somewhere.
Yeah.
feat of command.
Exactly. And again, this is not just a matter of drawing lines on a map. This is a matter of saying, this is how generals really operate. One of the interesting elements is that Patton wanted to continue driving north and cut off the bulge,
A new pocket.
except, according to Patton, Montgomery balked at doing it. Now, there are reasons that that happened, but one of the things that, again, is worth emphasizing, Montgomery's a British general. His style of fighting was based on losing manpower was not what you could afford anymore. The British didn't have manpower to lose. That doesn't mean you squander it, all right, because we never did. But the idea was you have to have a prepared, or as he used the word, tidy battlefield. And once you had everything in place, then you could fight. Almost a World War I type mindset. Very much a difference to the American mindset, which was run all over the place, create havoc and chaos, and it'll all sort itself out. The enemy's never going to know what's going to hit them. But like Falaise, the opportunity to seal this off is lost. And because it's lost, the Germans simply are pushed back out of the sack. So an opportunity lost? Not sure. One thing that happened, which again had a profound effect, is that at a place called Malmedy, American engineers had been captured, taken out into a field, and machine gunned. The word got out. And if you were a German, particularly SS, your life was very short. They were not feeling very generous towards you. Now, I keep this in mind because way back when I started talking about World War II, I said that there were intrinsic differences in the manner in which the Germans fought the Western Allies, the British and the Americans, the way they fought the Soviets, we call them the Russians, and the way the Americans fought the Japanese and the Japanese fought the Americans. And these differences, easy to plaster over the word, this is all racism. But I take us back to that first paragraph, the very first one I showed. On one side, you will do anything to win. Anything. If these guys are a burden, kill them. Bullets cost much less than a gallon of gasoline to put some of them in a truck and take them to a camp somewhere, which means I have to divert my transport. I have to send soldiers to guard them. They've got to be fed. Screw that. This is a fight to the death. However, somehow or other than an occasional atrocity like this, and there were several that occurred on the Western Front on both sides, but more on the German side by far than by the Allies. The point is that it never reached the level it did on the Eastern Front, and it never reached the level it did in the Pacific. And there's something to that we need to keep in mind. The bulge is eventually reduced. Is Hitler done? Nah. He musters another assault further south. Again, it kind of goes nowhere strategically. It was really unimportant. I'm kind of baffled because in spite of my disdain for this guy and how awful a person he was in many ways, he seemed to grasp things pretty clearly, but at this point, he was really losing it, in my view. And he was just flailing out wherever he could, using up whatever resources were left. And this other assault that took place further south was just nothing except consumption of resources. Yes.
Michael, the Malmedy massacre was under the command of Joachim Peiper, who was tried but never convicted as a war criminal, who settled in the northwest of France. And 3 years later, he woke up dead. No one was ever convicted, but that was the end of Joachim Peiper.
There are a lot of stories like that. We can remember that the Jews went after a lot of the camp commanders and senior German officials after World War II. The Armenians did that against the Turks, looked for many of those who were responsible for the 1915 to 23 massacres and assassinated them. This is what happened if you were caught as a spy. Skorzeny, who was, again, an amazing commander on the German side, had developed a unit with American equipment, uniforms, and American English speakers, not English. Dropped them behind the lines. They were to disrupt movement. They were to turn signs around, misdirect traffic so they wouldn't go where they were supposed to go. There was even thought that Eisenhower was to be assassinated, and he got sequestered in Versailles, I think it was, and stuck there for a while with practically a division around him trying to make sure he didn't get killed. And these guys, they lost it all.
They didn't know the passwords, which involved baseball.
Yeah, exactly. Not like the Americans did in the Pacific. It's a bad joke, but they actually did it. The password would be something like Lily Lullaby, Riri Riverby. But they tried to use the phonetics to get people to reveal themselves. This shows you by the end of the 16th of January, again, the Germans had lost a great deal. They're down greatly in equipment, much of which had to be abandoned because they literally ran out of fuel. You just can't tow a tank out of that sack. You have to abandon it. I thought this picture was kind of interesting, just as a scene of tranquility. Old Bessie down here is kind of saying, what comes next? I hope I'm not dinner. As this fighting concludes into February, the West Wall finally is reached. The high command, the Allied high command really gets into a mess at this particular point. Now remember, the war concludes May 5th, all right? So it's only a couple months down the road, but Montgomery and Eisenhower really get into it to the point where Eisenhower basically tells his superior, Roosevelt and Churchill, because they're both his superior, you either shut Montgomery down or I'm out of here. Churchill gets in touch with Montgomery and says, if push comes to shove, you're gone. So make nice. because Montgomery is the most senior British general and the most successful British general. And he thought he was protected. His rank was actually higher than General Marshall's and Eisenhower's. As a field marshal, he had a higher rank, but he was a subordinate. And Churchill told him, that's the way it's going to be. This gives you an idea of the casualties. We're talking about 3.5 weeks of fighting. Okay. 23,000 POWs. Notice this. Why so many? The Germans launched a surprise air attack, having consolidated many of their fighters and fighter bombers secretly. And when the weather broke, they were first on the scene to hit American and British airfields and wrecked a lot of those planes on the ground. You'd think by this time, oh, don't we have this figured out? Not really. This is just another example of the difficulties that were being faced. There are dams all along the Roar River. They had to be taken, or if they were blown or the floodgates were opened, the amount of water flooding downstream would be so enormous that it would basically block any capability to the north to get across the rivers. Think of what happened in Ukraine, the Donets. They blew dams, flooded the area all the way down to the Black Sea. Basically, it's Zaporozhye, I think it is. They basically prevented the Russians from doing anything except getting back across the river because they were on the wrong side at that point. They wouldn't be able to be supplied. Okay. The emphasis shifts back a bit. The Allies, the United States, has taken quite a bloody nose, as you can see. The dams are blown. And over the period of a month, there's continued incremental improvements, but still it takes a while to get to Germany itself. I mention this only because there was another pocket further in the south called the Colmar pocket. Gene and I did not visit that, though there was a trip that you could go to Colmar. And this was eventually reduced. Again, the Germans escaping. Although Hitler told a number of these units they had to stay in place. And of course, they got the crap beaten out of them in the process, but they managed to get out. Now, this I'm going to leave because we're just at the 3 o'clock mark. But here is the second major screw up that the United States did. The first, in my own opinion, was in Casablanca when Roosevelt comes out without having told Churchill, unconditional surrender. Oops. Now, did that mean that it wouldn't be an unconditional surrender anyway? Not necessarily. But why tell the enemy that unless you have him so beaten that he has to quit? And in January of November and December of 42, that's hardly the case. You've just landed in North Africa, for God's sake. Unconditional surrender. What made it worse was this was released. Morgenthau, the Secretary of the Treasury, what point did he have in drafting this document? Well, he thought it would be useful. Now, I'll outline this to you because when this became known, Goebbels in particular, as he did with the unconditional surrender stuff, had a propaganda field day. If we surrender, this is what's going to happen to us. Oh, demilitarized Ukraine.
Germany.
No, I know it says Germany.
No, good.
I'm drawing a comparison. Russian control over the Ukrainian government. All right, restitution, reparations. Okay.
minerals like that we'll get from.
Mineral rights.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Our
The
purpose-
point being that when this came out, if you are an ordinary German, not a Nazi, may not even care much for Hitler, you know that family and friends, close relatives, maybe, brother, husband, whatever, has been killed or maimed in this god-awful war. Your cities have been pounded into rubble repeatedly and so on. And there doesn't appear to be an end in sight. And then somebody says this. You're gonna quit? You might. Certainly there were many Germans who were saying, maybe this is better than what we're suffering already. But it goes back to that, I'd rather stand and be shot than be a slave on my knees. So this is the kind of thing that looks like what could happen with the partitioning. And in it, much of your territory is stripped away or controlled by others. So if you're Ukraine and you're looking at this loss, are you going to say, if I can keep this part of Ukraine and I give up Donetsk and Lugansk, the Crimea, Zaporozhye, is that okay as long as the killing ends? When I have no capacity to retake it. Because the Germans have no capacity at this point. It's pretty clear that they're going to lose. The only question is, how long is it going to take? And what happens to the country afterward? So let's end there. And any questions, feel free to look at the maps. Take your time. I'm not going anywhere. So thank you for your attention. Jane, would you hit these lights, please?